This is Jill Pack with the Seasons of Joy podcast. This is episode number 140, entitled Building Longer Tables with Ian Simpkins. Are you a woman of faith who is struggling to navigate your current season of life? Do you feel like life is just happening to you instead of for you? My name is Jill Pack, and I'm a certified faith-based life coach and a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I want you to know that no matter your season or your circumstance, it is possible to create a more joyful life, and I would love to show you how. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, my friends. Welcome to this week's episode. I hope you're doing well, and I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. I recently had the chance to interview Pastor Ian Simpkins. Ian is someone that I have been following on Instagram for a couple of years, and he is a pastor in a church just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, called the Bridge Church. And he just shares his thoughts every day on social media, and I love to see. I wake up every day wanting to see what he has to share. And I had this idea that I would love to have him on and talk about the topic of building longer tables. And you'll understand what that means as we share this conversation together. But the thing I loved about this conversation is just how fun and authentic and real it was. Now, Ian and I are of different faiths, but we both believe in Jesus. And so it was a great conversation to talk about some things around tables, this idea of tables. And so without further ado, I'm going to share my conversation with Pastor Ian Simpkins. All right. Okay. I'm so excited for this conversation. I have invited Pastor Ian Simpkins to come and just have a conversation with me about building longer tables. But I'm going to have him first introduce himself and tell us a little bit more about him and what he does and why he does it.
Yeah, boy. How much time do you got? I could go for a while with
Right.
that. First off, thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm honored to be invited into this conversation. I'm a Midwest boy, born and raised in Detroit, moved to Chicago to study student ministry. And that's where I got my first job and met my wife and had our first couple of kids. And then almost 4 years ago, we came down here to the Bridge just outside of Nashville. And we're just loving it. We're loving the Southern life, and it's been a trip. We're having a blast.
Yeah, I love that. So did you always know you wanted to be a pastor? Like, where did this come from?
Not even a little bit. You know,
Not even a little bit.
My parents were like kind of self-proclaimed Jesus hippies. And so I've been going to church since I was probably 6 or 7 and had a decent relationship with church. You know, a lot of people, had this like big kind of angsty breakup with the church. And I was like, I don't mind it. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't for me though. My intent was to move to a coast somewhere and learn to surf and play music and, figure it out. And then when I was about 16, our pastor pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I want you to preach next month." And I was like, "No, thank you." And he said, "I wasn't asking you, I was telling you." I was like, "Oh gosh, okay." And so I delivered this sermon, and it was terrible. It was so bad and so embarrassing. And I walked off the stage totally embarrassed. And this older woman in our church came up to me and said, well, she said 2 things. She said, one, that was pretty bad. I'm like, thank you. I'm aware. But then she said, I believe that the Lord has given you a voice and you better learn how to actually use it. And that probably began a kind of trajectory shifting. I wish I could tell you right then and there. I dropped everything and applied to ministry school. There's probably another 3 years of wrestling / running. Mm-hmm. And the Lord just kind of chipping away at my heart. But that was definitely where the seed was planted. And there's been a lot of other bumps along the way, like the first job that I got out of undergrad the lead guy was removed a year after I started for a whole laundry list of issues. And so like it's not been a smooth, straight path at all, but it is the kind of thing though that I wake up most days and can't believe I get to be a part of this work. Like
Yeah.
our church is incredible. Our team is amazing. It's really hard at times and can be really weighty, but it's also I just am so grateful to be able to be a part of it. So it's strange now 20 years later to be like, boy, what kindness that I get to do it now. But no, at 16, 17, 18, I had no intentions whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you say is your biggest, like when you say, I can't believe I wake up every day and get to be a part of this? Like,
Yeah.
what is it about that you love so much?
I mean, where to begin? For me, it is to get a front row seat to life transformation that just never gets old. And transformation, even that word tends to have a real kind of positive connotation, and a lot of times there's gravity to it. Like I can't tell you how many times I've held people's hand as they breathe their last breath. Like there's a weightiness to that. We've walked with people through addiction and recovery and divorce and reconciliation, and so it's definitely not this like rosy up and to the right, but the privilege and honor, one, of being able to like open God's word every week and say, here's what I think the Spirit's teaching us in the ways of Jesus. That's a gift. I get to go on a treasure hunt every week and
Yeah.
like discover like, all right, Lord, what are you teaching us right now? And help me articulate that in a way that's actually helpful. But then
Yeah.
the actual like the work of the people, like being a pastor is a strange thing because people invite you in to the most intimate parts of their lives, even just by nature of the role. And
Mhm.
I obviously there are some weeks that are very, very heavy and you feel like you got the wind knocked out of you. And then also in that same week, you can have just the most elated phone call, or I get to officiate a wedding, or like there's just
Yeah.
it's such a, and no 2 weeks are ever the same for my
Right.
kind of brain and sentiment. Like that is a real plus. But
Thing. Yeah.
yeah, it's just a joy to be a part of all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you said it's all of it. Like, I think
Right.
it's the bitter and the sweet
Yes,
that make the whole experience so
that's right.
beautiful.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So I love that. Okay. So I want to dive into this idea about building tables. I'm trying to think of when I first began following you. I don't know when it
Hmm.
was. It's been at least a couple of years.
Oh
Um
wow. Wow.
and or maybe a year. I don't know. It's been longer than a year.
Hmm.
And you just showed up on my feed one day, and I love I mean, for those that don't follow Ian, it's black with white writing. Like so it's just so there. Like the
Hmm.
words are just there. It's not distracted by a picture or anything. It's just words.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that's what caught my attention. Usually it's the words that are that are written there. But I just remember thinking, wow, this guy gets it. Like
Hmm.
this guy has
Thank
has some profound things to offer. And so I actually look forward
Hmm.
every day to see what's Ian going to write today. I
Thank
love
you. That's
it.
so kind.
Yeah, but the one thing that like I said in the beginning, was this idea about tables. And I went through recently to just see, okay, what were some of his posts about tables? Because
Hmm.
that is what resonated with me. And I think as a woman in the mid-season of life, we
Hmm.
have a lot of tables. We've
Hmm.
sat at a lot of tables, right? And maybe that's what resonated with me, is because a table is like in my house, that's a
Hmm.
central piece.
Yeah.
The table and the relationships that we have and we make and we develop
Hmm.
around those tables are power. It's a powerful sacred space.
Hmm.
And I remember posting a picture around the holidays just of my table saying, this is a sacred space for me
Yeah.
because of the people that gather here.
That's right.
But so to build on that, this idea of longer tables,
Hmm.
tell me what you mean by that. I would love to hear your thoughts about what you're trying to get across with that?
I love this topic. I could talk for the next hour about this, but I mean, I have to first give props to my parents. I think this is where I first saw it modeled. I'm the oldest of 7 kids, and for the first, 12, 13 years of my life, we lived in a tiny little house outside Detroit. And even with all that going on, I can remember countless times that my parents were helping friends that had gotten kicked out of their house or that needed a meal or were just in need of a friend. Like they just had this open door posture, even though we were already kind of cramped in this little house. Like it was just always there. And they didn't necessarily use the language of longer tables, but like that posture of hospitality was always there. But
Hmm.
we as a church have been wrestling with this idea of the table for almost 3 years now, and actually began last year with a 12-week series on Jesus and the table. And it was remarkable, but also kind of embarrassing that I've been preaching the Bible for 20 years and it like never leapt out at me the way that it did. Like this is one of Jesus's main like missional discipleship tools is this table. It's not just about dinner time. It's about, he's upending social norms. He's speaking truth in a really provocative way. Like, and a lot of it just happened in these relational spaces of a table. So for me, longer table isn't just have bigger potlucks. That's probably part of it. But I
Hmm.
think we live in an era where people are putting up taller and taller privacy fences and everyone's driving right into their garage, closing the door, and then waking up and doing the same thing the next day. And I'm like, Jesus seems to be pretty preoccupied with this idea of loving your neighbor, and most of us don't even know our neighbor. It is such
Yeah.
an odd. We jump to all of the finer nuance of theology, and I'm like, I'm not even sure the vast majority of us are living out like Great Commission, Great Commandment stuff. And so the reason that the table is really compelling to us is that regardless of your class or background, you probably have one. And everyone's tables look different. You might have a really beautiful magazine ready banquet table, and you might have a collapsible card table. But either way, part of what we wanted to do as a church was I want every time we sit at a table anywhere for us to think, Lord, at this table as it is in heaven. That is the breadcrumb starting point that I wanted everyone in our church to feel like invited to and equipped to. Hey, this isn't just for the evangelists or the people with seminary degrees or the people with beautiful mansions. All of those things are fine. But all of us have access to this tool where, most of us are distracted by our devices. I think people are longing for like true incarnational presence. And I
Hmm.
think that the table is maybe the best place for that to be lived out.
Mm. I just love that so much. So how are you inviting people to think about the table in your
Yeah.
congregation? Like what is a practical way to use that table as a tool?
Yes. So many. So when we talk about apprenticeship to Jesus, I'm a Venn diagram nerd. So if I can make it into a Venn, I'm there. And
I
so
love it.
the three circles of the Venn, the way that we talk about it is presence, formation, and mission. And the verse that we reference is when Jesus says, "Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men." You see
Mhm.
all three of them in that one verse. Come follow me is an invitation to presence with Jesus. Just don't just learn about him, but like be with him.
Mhm.
He says, and I will make you. So there's a formational piece. Like there's a transformation that happens when we spend time with Jesus. But the transformation doesn't end there. He says, and I will make you fishers of men. I'm gonna send you back out. So when we talk about our tables, I think there's a presence piece, a formational piece, and a missional piece. So how can we be mindful about using our tables as a place of like abiding in Jesus, of intimacy with Jesus? That could look like, waking up earlier in the morning and just dedicating 10 minutes at your table just to be with, we'll provide Bible reading resources and apps and things like that. The formational piece is, are we, if you have kids, we provided some tools from things as simple as, conversation cards or resource like placemats and resources to sort of prompt like richer biblical discussion with our families or our children or our small groups. Like how are we being formed at the table and not just like taking in data. And then the missional piece is who are we inviting to our table? Like how are we, if missions isn't just simply hopping on a plane and going somewhere else, but sometimes just going across the street. And so sometimes that looks like, last year in the fall, We threw a bunch of block parties all over our city, and we equipped and resourced our church. Like, here's how to throw a great party. I've said it a few times. I think Christians should be known for throwing the best parties, and yet often that's not the case. So, like, maybe you're not ready to invite someone to a dinner at your house, but you could probably throw a party and then get them out of their house into the front yard and even just get to know their name and a little bit of their story. So we're trying to create these sort of breadcrumb opportunities. Like, I want to kind of lower the pressure of like, oh man, if I'm not baptizing everyone after one conversation, I'm failing. We're like, no, no, no. This is yeast and bread dough stuff. This is like playing the long game. Like, how do we create, we had an elder that was saying we should create lunch boxes for kids that have like prayer prompts that they could take with themselves to school, or candles with like we're just trying to create these little resources as a way to kind of bring our focus back to, man, how do I think presence, formation, and mission at this table? And that could be a boardroom table. That doesn't have to be your dining room table. That could be at a coffee shop. Like, how are we actually engaging people in our neighborhoods, in our cities, and thinking through the lens of presence, formation, and mission?
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. And I even think like, I don't know, one thing I've been thinking of is like just our interactions with people we don't know. Like
Yeah.
I know that you talk about friends, neighbors, strangers,
Yeah.
enemies,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of different kind of people at our table,
Mm.
but just at the grocery store, right? Making eye contact with someone and smiling. I just think, I don't know, it's interesting to watch people that look down and don't
Mhm.
make eye contact, or like that's just my goal, is to see a person as a person and look them in the eye,
Totally.
right? I think that's an invitation, is to let me see you
Yeah. Right.
and see me, right? So we can see this everywhere. Yeah. So the counter at the store is
Mm-hmm.
a table. Yeah,
Totally.
I just love that. I love that idea of that the table is there's no set description of what a table is. It's
That's right.
all
We I had a woman come up to me in the lobby a couple weeks ago, and she works a graveyard shift at a local gas station. And she beelined it to me, just tears streaming down her face. And she showed me this text thread of this man that she just led to the Lord at 2 a.m. at her gas station. And she just kept saying, "That's my table." Like, she's like, "Is that what you've been talking about?" I'm like, "That's exactly what I'm talking."
yes.
Never in a million years did I picture a gas station counter, but we talked about it. We prayerfully planted the seed, and she's now thinking with kingdom imagination about her environment, even though it's way different than my environment. And that's what gives me so much joy, is when people take it and the Holy Spirit speaks to them in a way that's transformative, and then now they're applying it in their context, which I never could have thought of if I wanted to. So like
Right.
there's a beautiful kind of organic thing where people are taking ownership of it and saying, "Oh, okay, what are the tables and spaces in my life, to your point, where
Yeah.
people are longing for some kind of faithful presence?" And I think that gives me a lot of joy to see that kind of take root in different environments.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so here's a question about that then. Like I think sometimes it's easy to see how this plays out in the things outside of us, like our neighbors or our church congregations or the grocery store, or right, like this outside of us world. But what
Yeah.
about as in a family, right?
Mhm.
And as your family grows, you have different dynamics, different faith journeys, different belief systems. How do we build that table
Yeah.
in that setting?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to, the table, whether it's in a family context or a roommate or a small group, I think a lot of what the table does is like a retirement fund. It's like I'm making deposits that I might not have to draw on for a while, but if I wait until there's an emergency, then it's not going to be there. I think a lot of people, they have these crises in their relationships, and they try and draw on a bedrock that has never been, that foundation's not there. And so
Mm,
when we talk about, I mean, there's a lot of pretty startling data about the decline of like family dinner time. I probably don't have to tell you, like, screen usage. Anxious Generation was one of the
mm,
best-selling books of last year. The jury's not out anymore, that we are starving for like meaningful relational connection. And what's been so, honestly, as a pastor, one of my greatest joys is when someone says, I disagree with you on literally everything you're about, but I'd love to have a cup of coffee. Like
Mm.
that, there's something to that. Like, hey, I already know you're team Jesus and you're going to talk about the Bible. And I don't agree with you on any of that, but there's enough relational equity to like, I am curious though. I'd like to pick your brain about more of those things. I think in our families, if we're like, man, I'm not here to shove something down your throat every dinner time, but I do actually want to know like you as a person and what makes you tick and your hopes and dreams. And I think at the very least, that can't prevent someone from deconstructing or walking away, but you're at least laying a foundation where like we know that like this is a safe space to be honest about what it is that we're reading and struggling with and where our doubts are. And I think thinking again about the long game of building those relational roots within your marriage, within your kids is part of what I think the table does. It provides a space for that to be present. And I think the more that we do that, the more we'll have honest conversations about where our heart and head really are, you know?
Yeah, I love that so much. I think what I've noticed with people I work with, and even myself
Mm,
as I've navigated adult children, is I think it can be tempting or natural to be afraid
mm,
of someone who thinks differently.
yeah, right.
And not so much the stranger. I mean, I think that's another conversation, but it can be scary when someone you've raised or you've
Mm,
interacted with your whole life is doing that deconstruction or that different faith transition or whatever it may be. That can be scary.
totally.
And I think you touched on it perfectly, and this is what I try to teach people is curiosity is gold. Like
Yes,
it's just magic because once we quit making a judgment about someone, we don't have to be afraid. We can just
that's right.
invite that curiosity, which I think feeds love because
Mm,
then we begin seeing them as a person, not as the effect of their choices or
yeah.
whatever. So I
Which is
love that idea.
which is so needed though. And I think as long as our debates and disagreements remain behind a screen, that is the easiest place to demonize and vilify. If all
Mhm.
you are the sum of your beliefs, convictions, or voting patterns, it's easy to flatten that person into a two-dimensional, you know what I mean? That is
Yeah.
almost expected. But once Brene Brown's line is people are hard to hate up close.
Yes.
I think that's really true. Like you may still do, I never want us to think that we're being I never want to present like a picture of naivete to our church like, hey, have one dinner and you'll convert your whole block. Like I don't
Yeah.
think that's realistic. But
Right.
you will now have a name and a face and a story behind. Same with your kids, same with your spouse, same whoever it is you're talking about. The ministry of presence, even like Sherry Turkle is this professor at MIT, and she's done some really brilliant research on even the presence of a phone like out on your table, even if it's face down, drastically diminishes our willingness and capacity to have vulnerable conversations.
Mhm.
So even just being at a
Wow.
table with your phone out, something is
Yes.
still being hindered there. Like we are longing for, do you actually hear me? Are you actually present with me? Do you actually love me? Do you actually care about me? Like I the longer I do this thing called ministry, the more convinced I am that that is every single person on planet Earth. And yet,
Yeah.
sort of like, I don't know, we're more and more entrenched in our kind of tribalistic tendencies and our echo chambers and our confirmation bias. And
Mhm.
I think longer tables help combat some of that trend.
Yeah, I love one of the quotes that I found very first of yours was, "If your feed is full of one perspective right now, it might be time to build longer tables instead of higher fences."
Yeah,
And
right.
especially in the political climate that we live in right now, right? We've seen that. It's so easy to get that algorithm shooting the things that agree with you.
Mhm.
And so it is that echo chamber. And so when something different comes up, it can and I'll read comments sometimes on things, and it's like, I kinda like, "Oh my gosh," like, they're ripping the person apart, or
Right,
they're totally agreeing, and I don't even wanna be on that team either. Like,
right,
either
right.
one feels too much for me, but I just think that there was another one that you said, it gives us here it is. Maturity is moving from being a recipient of grace to being responsible for extending it. If
Mhm.
we claim to be saved by grace, but don't show grace to others, that should give us pause.
Yeah.
And that is, again, building that table, inviting
Right.
people to the table is extending grace.
I think you're spot on. I think you used the word curiosity, and I've been banging that drum for a while. It feels like in leadership circles, we have held up confidence and competence as supreme, and I'm for both of those things. I think they're very valuable. I would love to see an uprising of leadership books around curiosity and humility, though, because I think
Yes.
the leaders that I most resonate with, that I'm most drawn to, are the ones that are saying, "Here's what I've found, but I still have a lot to learn, or I'm still growing." And I think I understand, if I'm being charitable, I understand why echo chambers are so appealing. Like, who doesn't love a feed of what you already believe? Like,
Mhm.
choosing to build a longer table is very uncomfortable. So I always want to be very blunt. Like, hey, this is not a path to ease. So you have to appeal to something deeper. Like, it can't just be, well, my pastor said I should, and he twisted my arm and guilted me into it. Like, that's never gonna be fruitful. To help people actually be truly curious is an act of humility. It's maybe there's more to this person, and they had a sign out front for that candidate, or I know they attend that
Mm.
church and not that church, or whatever it is. As long as we keep them at arm's length, we can come up with whatever. We are storytelling creatures. We can come
Mhm.
up with whatever narrative we want about them until you actually meet with
Get to
them
know them.
face to face and get to know them. Yeah, it's a game
Yeah.
changer.
Yeah. This is another quote you said that I just loved because I think this fits exactly what you're talking about. It says, blank is made in the image and likeness of God. There's not a single person or people group you could put there that would make that sentence untrue.
Hmm.
And I think that that is something that when we see people, as children of God,
Yeah.
we treat them different. If we view them, there's a group called the Arbinger Institute, and they
Mm.
talk about do peace building and
Mm.
this idea of I thou versus I it, right?
Yes.
And if we can see each other as this child of God, whether it be our adult children, our neighbor, or the checker at the gas station, right? If that they are in the likeness of God,
Yeah.
how would we treat them? And would we invite them to our table? Yeah.
Yeah. What is so interesting about that is there's a demographic of people that will roll their eyes at the simplicity of that, I think.
Mhm.
And I can't help but be convicted by, like, when Jesus, points at a group of children and says they're actually closer to the kingdom than you are. Like, there's something about childlike faith or wonder or innocence, whatever it is. And yet sometimes, with our ministry degrees and our qualifications or whatever, we go, well, yeah, sure, everyone's made, in the image and likeness of God, but we got, this is the most important blank in our whole life, or this is the whatever. And I'm not discrediting that, but I do wonder if that became like a spiritual discipline to keep at the front of our mind, this person is an image bearer of God above and before anything else. That doesn't mean that you can't get angry or that you shouldn't at times. This doesn't mean that you can't hold people accountable. Doesn't mean that you can't stick to your convictions, all of that. But it should change the way we actually treat and talk to people if that was the first instinct whenever we encounter, especially someone that we're, like you were saying, afraid of or confused by or hurt by. That is a much more revolutionary thing than I think most people have
Yeah.
realized.
Yeah. And it's not easy,
Right.
right? When we're feeling that pain or that hurt or something, right? Of course, we want to go on the defensive or
Yes.
it's protection, it's protecting us. But to take that pause, and that's what I teach people a lot is like, there is
Mhm.
so much power in pausing.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
little second is such where agency occurs,
Yeah.
right? This
Right.
gift to choose occurs in that little pause
That's right.
to do something different. And
Yes.
so, in that pause, looking at someone as a person, as an image of God, can change everything, but
That's
it's
right.
not easy. Yeah.
You're so right. Well, there's an app I downloaded recently, and it's really simple but pretty brilliant. The only thing that it does is you assign it certain apps, and when you go to open that app, a little notification pops up and just says, "Are you sure?" That's
Oh,
it.
I love that.
It doesn't freeze
Oh,
anything. It doesn't lock you out. It's that
right.
minor, like, it's the pause. Like, hey,
Yes.
you're autopiloting right now to an
Yeah.
app you maybe don't need to be on. And the amount of time
Yeah.
it's caught me and I go, yeah, I don't need to be on Instagram. What am I doing? That
Yes.
just the
Yes.
pause, the disruption for a brief moment to say, hey, remember, go ahead and have this discussion, but remember, this is
Yeah.
an image bearer. Like, just
Yes.
I think we need that for our souls.
Yes. That reminds me of this story I once heard a woman in our church talked about how she was in line at a grocery store
Mm,
and she, how many of us pull out our phone
yeah,
in that
right.
line, right? Like, oh, I'm standing here. I might as well look at this or that. And she went to reach for it. And then she had this thought, which was
Mhm.
the spirit saying, no, don't pull your phone out.
Yeah.
Be
Wow.
here. Be here. And as she's standing in line, there's this older gentleman, probably in his 90s. I'm
Mhm.
thinking, I can't remember the exact age, but elderly. And she started talking to him, how are you today? And he said, I'm good. Today's my birthday.
Oh, wow.
Nobody knew it was his birthday. And she's like,
Wow.
oh, happy birthday. And it's like, and she talked about this interaction, how that was such a gift to her, where she had taken that prompting to actually see a person as a person instead of
Yes.
pulling out that distraction.
Yes. So good.
Um, and so I try to do it. I'm not always good at that.
Yeah,
I
same,
try.
same. Yes, yeah.
We
Try being
try.
the operative word. David Foster Wallace gave a commencement speech at Kenyon College years ago, and it was turned into a video called "What is Water?" or "This is Water." And I try to watch it at least once a year because it has that exact same kind of sentiment. Like, hey, when we get caught on this autopilot and the blinders are on, and we're prone to myopic living where it's just about me and my little kind of kingdom, how can we hit pause on that and actually see people for who they are? It's
Mhm.
a beautiful piece because it's decades old now and feels like it was written yesterday. Like, oh, I
Yeah.
think he was really onto something here.
Yeah. So applicable even
Yeah.
now. Yeah. So what were some of how do we do that? How do we see people as people?
That's a great question. I think my answer is going to be pretty unextraordinary because I think in the West in particular, it's easy for us to get really riled up with sort of like sensationalized or emotive. We go to a conference or we go to a retreat, and I'm for all of those things, and we get like inspired for a week, and then the world beats it out of us again. I
Mhm.
think what's actually much more compelling are like the daily mundane habits of how we choose to live our life, and I think that's the crucible of formation is in, Annie Dillard says, how we live our days is how we live our lives. We
Mhm.
see this with New Year's resolutions, where every December we say to ourselves, I'm going to work out 47 times a day. And you're like, probably not. That's maybe not a
Yeah.
good idea. So like a little thing for me, and this is such a small thing, but when I get home from work, I turn my phone off entirely until my kids go to sleep. Now that's at that most 90 minutes. That is not that big of a sacrifice, but I've created a liturgy of my driveway that when I pull in, before I just rush out into my house, because I'm hungry or whatever, I say a prayer and I power it off entirely. And that's not transforming our entire family, but I know at least for those 90 minutes, like my kids aren't going to like hear me respond to them and see that I'm also scrolling on my phone. Like I'm present with them. And sometimes we still have a blow up and somebody throws something against like it's all,
Right. Of
I
course.
got little kids. It's all there. But
Yeah.
creating these like liturgies of like, it's exactly the prayer that I mentioned at the beginning. Like, Lord, at this table as it is in heaven. If we could make that a
Mhm.
regular prayer going into a heated discussion or a lovely one, it's this prompt. It's that pause again. Like, oh, right. I'm charged with the task. If I'm in Christ, part of my responsibility is to by the Spirit of God bring the kingdom of heaven to earth now. How can I, even if this interaction is 5 minutes, how can
Mhm.
I be mindful of that and to keep coming back to that? Brother Lawrence in his book The Practice of the Presence of God, he says the role of the Christ follower is to learn to live in two places at once, and he would say doing the dishes and in the presence of God. doing the
Mhm.
gardening and in the presence of God. And I think the more that we can learn to live in those two places at once, it will
Yes.
transform the way that we see the people that we interact with. And I think that's at least a good starting point.
Yeah, I think that is beautiful. I love that. I love that. Okay, one more thing here. When you I saw this post that said diversity equals a seat at the table.
Mm.
Inclusion equals a voice at the table. Dignity equals heard at the table. Belonging equals helping pick the menu. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh man. I don't even sometimes some of those posts, most of those posts are just me trying to work out my own thoughts.
Yeah.
So there's always a lot of trepidation before I hit share and I'm like, I think this is
Yeah.
right, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I love it. I love this.
Yeah, for anyone who's like heading to my Instagram, just know this is like the internal ramblings of somebody trying to make sense of the world a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times a lot of that was birthed from the realization that people know when they're just a project.
Mhm.
If we did a series on the table and they said, "All right, this week, go invite someone who's hard to love to your table." Like, even if you don't tell them that, people know if they're just like a box to check. And I think we
Mhm.
do the same thing sometimes around diversity conversations. Like, okay, I did it. I did the thing. And you're like, yeah, but
Mhm.
that didn't actually stretch you. That wasn't disruptive to like your own kind of rhythm and kingdom that you were building. And so
Mhm.
it has to be more than just, oh, did I do the thing? It's man, who is actually included in the tapestry and conversation of your life? And that
Mhm.
is easier said than done. It is messy and there's layers to it and it's not always going to go well. I was just really compelled by if all we're really accomplishing is some sort of like box check moralism, but that's not actually going to transform the human heart. Like it has to be something, to your point again, if we're not actually truly curious about people who look and talk and think and believe and act and vote differently than we do, then we might have them at our table, but we're maybe not actually practicing the
Mhm.
kind of like kingdom hospitality that Jesus was modeling. Jesus
Yeah.
found himself regularly at very different kinds of tables and calls people out. And you have a tax collector who is, I don't we don't see anywhere in the text that Jesus led him in the sinner's prayer. He just had dinner with them and it resulted
Yeah.
repenting, a metanoia, a changing of his ways. I'm gonna make right all of this money that I wrongly, there's just
Yeah.
it's not a one size fits all like blueprint. And so that post was my attempt to try to like, man, how can we drill down past simply like, oh, I did a practice that my pastor said I should do, to like genuine relationship. My welfare is not like kind of intertwined with yours. That's like a different thing than just, oh, I had one missional meal this week. That's a good starting
Yeah.
point, but I'm trying to challenge myself first to something a
Yeah.
little more enigmatic.
Yeah. No, I love that because, we started this conversation around tables, but
Yeah.
this takes this to the next level, right? Like,
Mm,
let's look at our tables and
mm,
are we diverse? We're letting people come to our table, but are we including them in the table? Are we, you know, hearing what they have to say? And are we
right.
letting them be part of the conversation and actually adding their 2 cents, if you will,
Totally.
right? So
Totally.
it's expanding this idea of the table to
Mm,
something different, and you touched on it, I think, so beautifully. It said, "Are we changing the human heart?"
mm,
Right? Like, is our table changing us?
yeah. Right.
And
Right.
again, that's
Mm,
ultimately, that's who we have the most control over of changing,
that's
right?
right.
Is
That's right.
ourself. And so as we expand our tables, yeah, we can influence and affect other people, but at the end of the day, are we changing
Mm,
within us? Are we interacting in a way that the Savior would, or
that's right.
right, aligned with who he is? So
Totally.
I love
Totally.
that, the expansion of the table.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that is the maybe the most difficult thing to reconcile is our willingness to be transformed in the process. We have a very, and I think well-meaning. I grew up going to missions trips, and a lot of the sentiment was we're going to go to this village and we're going to make a difference in this village for them. I think that comes from a very noble, charitable space.
Mhm.
It wasn't until college, though, that a professor of mine really began to challenge that. Like, are we even going with the posture and the heart of a learner, though? Do we assume that we'll be changed at all in the process? Or do we have
Yeah.
a bit of a Messiah complex? Like, I'm here to impart
Fix
or
everybody else.
exactly. And that is the work I think of discipleship is that, man, it's not just the mission piece. It is also the formation piece. I'm being changed in the process to God's glory for the sake of the world. Like
Yeah.
a gift to be included in that, but we
Yeah.
haven't arrived either. And
Yeah.
it's actually really freeing to recognize.
Hmm. Yeah. Just recognizing that we're all in need of a savior.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if we're doing the best we can,
Right.
we
Right.
still need a savior,
Right.
right? So we're all beggars in a sense,
That's right.
right? Yeah, I love that. Okay, I'm going to end with one more, and then I want to ask you if there's any final things you want to share.
Sure.
But I want to end with this: we are never more like God than we love those that don't love us.
Mm,
When we refuse to retaliate, even when they're wrong,
yeah.
when we respond to mistreatment with kindness, when we extend generosity to those who need it. And then in that post, you referenced a story by Max Lucado, and it was a fight with a brother. And I didn't write the whole story down, but the quote he says is, "When I saw the image of my father
Mm,
in his brother, my enemy became my brother."
yeah.
And so speak to that for a minute.
Yeah. This is not an area of strength for me, just to be vulnerable. I'm not in any way offering any of this as someone who's arrived, but I have found there's so much freedom in looking at the life of Jesus and how he responded to mistreatment that we can love red letter gospel and we can put it on our walls and make t-shirts and mugs and throw pillows out of his statements. But I think where the rubber really hits the road is how do we treat people who mistreat us is, I think, the acid test of a transformed heart. It is so easy to love people who already love us
Mm,
and to treat well either the people that treat us well or that we can somehow benefit from. The real test, I think, is, man, how do I respond? The example is cheesy, but it's sort of like, if I fill a mug full of coffee, if you bump into me, coffee is going to spill out. Whatever is in us comes spilling out whenever we face friction, whenever we face disappointment, when someone, and that could be from someone getting our order wrong at Starbucks all the way to stabbing us in the back. But we're like a sponge. And I think, especially as like a preacher, as a communicator, I could deliver 1,000 eloquent sermons, but if what comes out of me when faced with this in traffic or when faced with this person that disagrees with me, that is a truer test of, I think, of what's actually going on inside. And that's really sobering because
mhm.
I can't tell you how many times the Spirit has convicted me, like, hey, you were just preaching about grace 48 hours ago, and you're going to treat this person that way when it's just the two of you behind closed doors. Like, that's not how that works. And so for me, it was at the very least me preaching to myself that,
Well, I think for all of us, right?
okay,
We
good.
all identify with this, right? Like this isn't the easy task. This is an uncomfortable
That's right.
road of stretching and growing on our way to becoming more like him, but it's
Right.
all messy along the way.
That's right. That's right. And there's grace for you if you're hearing this and you're like, man, I don't think I'm doing great there. That's okay.
Yeah,
Like
it's okay.
fall again on the grace of Jesus and ask for a transformed heart. Like the fruit of
Yeah,
the Spirit is, it's so interesting to me how often the fruit of the Spirit is labeled as like weakness or like, when someone is gentle or patient or
yeah,
kind, those don't tend to be traits that like quote unquote get stuff done in our kind of modern American context. And yet they seem to be pretty central to the life of a transformed heart. And I don't know, I think we need to
yeah,
reconcile. I think we maybe elevated certain traits above others
yeah,
and lost some of that invitation.
yeah. Which, to go back to what you referenced is, confidence and whatever is
Sure.
celebrated, but what about humility and curiosity? Like,
Totally.
can we invite those more in? And I think those things help us navigate that very quote that I read, right? Like
Absolutely. Yes.
curiosity and humility help us realize when we're wrong.
Yes,
Help us
exactly.
realize that retaliation isn't necessarily the way, even if they're wrong, right?
Yes.
And seeing that humility invites kindness, and
Yes.
curiosity invites kindness. So I
Right.
love that. I think that we could all infuse a little more curiosity and humility, our hearts would change,
Yeah, absolutely. I
right?
totally
A little.
totally agree.
And you said something once, and I've heard it somewhere else, and in this way, and I can't remember how you said it, but it's like, God is not a microwave God.
Yeah, right.
All of this is a slow cooker God. Like, this
Yeah.
is not meant, we're not meant to have this nailed today.
Mm,
That's the purpose of this life on earth, is to figure out how to do it. And we
yes.
learn by experience,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
Over and over again.
That's well said. God is way more crock pot than microwave.
Yeah. I just love that idea. So I could talk to you all day, Ian. This has been
Same.
such a pleasure, and I've learned so much from you. So thank
So
you.
my pleasure.
Is there anything you would like to leave listeners as we close out today?
I honestly think what you were saying there at the end is a perfect place to end. You know, I certainly live in an age and a culture where we crave fast expediency, results. And I think a lot of that can come from a good place. But like, I had a mentor that said, hey, measure your spiritual growth in months and years, not in minutes and seconds. You know, like it's the yeast and the bread dough again. Like when Jesus chose to describe the kingdom of God, he's like, hey, we're playing the long game here. And whether that's with yourself or someone far from God, like I really do think the crock pot microwave analogy has been a helpful one for me, because I can get pretty anxious about, like, I'm not seeing this happen yet, or I'm not moving the needle here yet. And that's okay to want to see that. But also it's birthing in me a level of trust in God's timing that is really, really needed, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Well, thank you again for being
My
here.
pleasure.
It's been so fun to chat with you.
Likewise. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to the Seasons of Joy podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends and family. If you want to learn more about me or how to work with me, just visit my website, www.seasons-coaching.com, and have a joyful week.